Well, welcome back. I hope you all found an enjoyable place to have lunch. We've got a very full afternoon. We've got two full-size lectures, a combination act by the museum's curators making a third. We then have the presentation by the person to whom we awarded the Rakow Commission, Josiah McElhenney, after which, and all of this will happen here. After Josiah McElhenney's presentation, we shall all go to the sculpture gallery where his commission has been installed. And after meeting the artist and admiring his work in the sculpture gallery, we will repair to the museum's other gallery areas for a reception. That's going to make a long afternoon, and so you may like to mark your programs. After Kurt Reed's lecture, after the second lecture of the afternoon, we're proposing to take a short, a 15-minute break, just to let everybody stretch their legs and maybe get a breath of fresh air before we continue with the afternoon's program. The program begins with a lecture by Jane Spillman, and this is one of those absurd occasions. All of us know Jane extremely well. All of us know Jane's very extensive knowledge of American glass and her long list of publications on the subject. What I think I'd like to emphasize is that the most recent major assignment that Jane has completed was the very exacting and sometimes rather difficult one of keeping her curatorial staff and me on schedule and in line while the great gallery renovation project proceeded. Without further ado, I'm going to invite Jane Shadel Spillman to talk to us about glass furniture and lighting, 1820-1920. Jane.
Thank you. Can everyone see me? Doesn't really matter. All you have to do is see the slides. I guess what's more important, everyone can hear me, can't you? The sound system's working. Is that okay? Okay. And we'll start with the first two slides. A little louder. Okay. I'm just starting with the pictures. There. Okay. When I first started thinking about doing this talk, I picked furniture and lighting as a topic because I did a great deal of work on 19th century glass furniture, specifically cut glass furniture and lighting, when I was doing our World's Fair show in 1986. There were a great many pieces of cut glass that were shown at the European World's Fairs, and I got very interested in them. So I thought I could do a talk on that, and then when I started, as you know, we have a Russian glass table, and I know there was a lot of Russian glass furniture, so I thought I would do both, early 19th century and late 19th century. But then I decided, once I got into organizing it, that I might as well give you a kind of introduction. And so what you see on the screen is a glass table which belonged to Louis XIV. And was made at least it shows up for the first time in an inventory of the royal possessions in 1681. The slide on the left is actually a conjectural restoration because the tabletop is now in a private collection in London. The legs, at least what we think are the legs of that table, are a very similar table. Three of them belong to the Smithsonian and are currently on exhibit in our gallery upstairs. And I think there are three more in the British Museum. But it's a really stunning example of the use of glass in furniture. You can see it's a kind of millefiori, and yeah, that's the top on the left. That's what's in London. It is absolutely out of this world stunning. Everything has been, it's a very carefully laid out design. And on the right is just a small detail of one part of that to show you how very detailed it is. This was, as far as we know, the first use or the first recorded use of glass to make a table like this. Glass had been used before, and it wasn't done again as far as we know, for quite a long time. It's very elaborate. It was obviously made for royalty. It was made by Bernard Perrault in Orléans or Navarre, as far as we know, made for the royal household. And at the time it must have taken, and the expense, it was obviously made for the royal household, and it's no wonder there weren't more of them made. But that's kind of the beginning of glass being used for furniture. Wait a minute, sorry, that one went too far. Go back. This is a tricky little thing here. Well, if the projectionist will kindly reverse it by hand, I want that other slide that flitted past. And in the meantime, I'll talk about the one on the right. There was, in the 18th century, there was a certain amount of wooden furniture made with glass decoration. And except for this one slide, now, I didn't touch that. You put that table back. There was a certain amount of wooden furniture made with glass decoration. And, okay, now let's try gently to advance that. Yes, that's right side up even. Okay. I feel like I'm a magician in charge of a disappearing egg. Okay, maybe if I don't touch it, it'll stay there. So I'm showing you the slide on the right, which is an Italian bureau in the Museo Vitraria in Venice, which has panels, inlaid panels, very much like the top of the Louis XIV table. And apparently some of these things were made in Italy. I have a quote from Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was an Englishwoman who did a great deal of traveling. She was in 1756, she was in Venice, and she wrote to her daughter in England, "I was shown of their own invention a set of furniture in a taste entirely new. It consists of 8 large armchairs, the same number of sconces, a table, and prodigious looking glasses, all of glass. It is impossible to imagine their beauty. They deserve being placed in a prince's dressing room or a grand cabinet, and the price demanded is £400, which actually seems very reasonable for that much furniture, wouldn't you think? But as far as we know, the pieces that she's talking about are not structurally made of glass, but are wooden pieces of furniture inlaid with glass. There was also a great use of their eglomise, of painted panels inlaid on glass, painted glass panels inlaid in furniture in the 18th century. But I'm not going to talk about that either, except to say that it existed. The use of glass structurally as furniture made almost entirely of glass starts in the late 18th century, and that's what I'm going to talk about. This particular table on the left is Russian. The earliest glass was Russian and French, and I think that's partly because the Russian royal court and the French royal court were both very ostentatious, or at any rate luxury-loving. And so especially in Russia, there was a market for very elaborate things. The table on the left was made for Catherine the Great around 1780. It has blue glass legs and a greenish glass top, and it was made at the Imperial Glass Factory in Russia. We don't know the exact date, but presumably in the 1780s. And this began a vogue for glass furniture in Russia that lasted for about 30 years. There were some really remarkable pieces. Okay. They were designed by architects very often. These are from 1807 on the left, and a similar one from 1808, designed by Thomas Tonen and made at the Imperial Glass Factory in Russia. I don't know if you'd exactly call these pieces of furniture, but I wouldn't really just call them glass bowls. They're ormolu and glass with metal mounts. The most famous piece, of course, is this one, which is one of 2. The other one is still in an imperial palace in Russia, and we believe these 2 have been made for the Russian royal family as well in the early 19th century. The one on the right is, again, a wooden table with a glass top made at the Imperial Glass Manufactory. But the most fascinating piece of Russian furniture to me is this glass bed. And I'm going to read you a description because I just wish I had a color picture. As far as we know, this doesn't exist anymore. But among other, the Tsar was very anxious to stay in touch with the Shah of Iran. And among other gifts, in 1819, he sent a glass pool to the Shah of Persia. Unfortunately, there's no description of this glass pool, but the Shah of Persia liked it very much. And he then desired to have with it a crystal bed to complete the set. I'm reading from a translation. Exactly how a bed completes the set of a pool, I'm not quite sure. But you will notice that the bed, which you see on the left hand, is set over a basin of water. So I suppose perhaps you could lie in bed and listen to the water, and it would be soothing. Anyway, a sketch for this, so the Shah approved it, the Tsar approved it. If the Shah wanted a bed, the Tsar was prepared to make one for him. And the project was affirmed by the Tsar Alexander I in April of 1824, and they calculated that it would cost 50,000 rubles. The bed was a spacious couch mounted on a broad pedestal. The glass parts were fastened to an iron frame which was plated with silver. The flooring and the semicircular steps to the couch were covered with polished turquoise glass, and the side walls and armrests were made of transparent crystal with rich and complicated facets. At the corners were set 4 cut crystal columns. The 7 fountains surrounding the bed were in the form of crystal vases. So you can see those vases that go around the railing there, and imagine them all splaying water. This was dispatched to Tehran in 1826 in a knockdown state. And accompanying it was an official, Lieutenant Noskov. He took with him 2 craftsmen from the glassworks. And reading what they went through to get the bed there, if you can imagine dragging it overland on wagons from Russia to Persia. And then the 2 craftsmen took sick and died. And so the army lieutenant had to wait until the Shah was ready and then put it together himself. But the Shah liked it and gave him a medal, and he got back home to Russia just over a year later, and the Tsar gave him another medal, so I guess he felt his year had been well spent. It's a pity. That's, as far as I know, the only illustration of the bed, and I imagine it doesn't still exist in Persia, but it certainly sounds like it was magnificent. On the right is a glass screen, also from the Russian factory, the Russian imperial factory, probably from the 1820s, about the same period as the bed. And that's just the banqueting hall at the Winter Palace with a torchère from about the 1830s. You can see it's metal mounted. This is the early 19th century, so these things are mostly made of colorless glass in ormolu mounts. They're not all of glass, which the later ones you'll see. And that's on the left is my last slide of Russian glass. That's a table from the 1830s, which is still in one of the palaces in St. Petersburg. But it began to go out of style in Russia around that time, and they didn't continue to make more of it. However, in France, royal glass furniture and large-scale glass pieces were just coming into style then. And what you see on the right is a sphere, that is a globe of the world, made by the factory of Saint Louis in 1818, which was quite a large-sized piece. What's more interesting, I think, is this set. The glass, which you see on the right, is now in the Louvre in Paris, and they believe that it belonged to the Duchesse de Berry. It seems to have been designed in 1819 for Escalier de Cristal, which was the French factory which David mentioned, or the French retailer, which David mentioned this morning. The glass actually came from Vanesh, which is a factory that at various times has been in Belgium and in France, depending on where the border is drawn. But on the left is the design, and they think that perhaps 2 of these were made, one for the Duchesse de Berry, and then the next one for Marie Louise, who is the Queen of Spain. It's possible that more than 2 were made, but there seem to have definitely been at least 2. And I've seen a very similar table in an auction catalog in the 1940s from Sotheby's, which has the same top but has a different base. I was not able to get a good photograph of that. So perhaps a few more of these were made, but this one is the only one I know of in a public collection. And if I do this, yes, that's the chair. That's a little better view of the chair. And then here, that's a French screen. Some of the things which I will show you are screens as well, which interest me because it's a very early use of pressed glass. That was shown in an exhibit in Paris in 1827, so it's very well recorded. And those roundels which you see are made of pressed glass. They're medallions. So, as I said, it's a very early use of pressed glass. And rather more impressive than one thinks of early pressed glass as usually being. Now I'm going to skip forward a little because glass, as it had gone out of fashion more or less in Russia, and it went out of fashion in France, or at any rate they weren't making glass furniture exactly like that. But beginning with the Crystal Palace in London in 1851, there was a real upsurge of interest in large-scale glass pieces, and there were several firms which were making them. The most spectacular exhibit at the London Crystal Palace was probably the Crystal Fountain, which Ian mentioned earlier, created by F&C Osler of Birmingham. The fountain stood 27 feet high, and a number of prints showing it in place survived. It actually was, they moved the Crystal Palace to Sydenham, and it burned, I think, in the 1930s. But Paul Hollister, who many of you know, actually visited it at Sydenham when he was a boy and saw the Crystal Fountain. So he's the only person I know who actually saw it. The Art Journal reporter said, perhaps the most striking object in the exhibition was the fountain. The lightness and beauty, as well as the perfect novelty of its design, impressed people. I think perfect novelty certainly had an amount to do with impressing people, but just the same, it must have been very beautiful. The piping and metal supports were cleverly hidden by cut glass pieces, and the effect was really quite dazzling. Osler's other notable display was a pair of 8.5-foot candelabra, which had been purchased by Queen Victoria, or by Prince Albert for Victoria, and that's what you see on the left. These can still be seen today at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. For the next half-century, Osler, Baccarat, and other glassmakers made larger and larger candelabra for candles, for gas lighting, and finally for electricity. And they also experimented with seating furniture and with tables. And these are, on the left is, I'm going to show you World's Fair slides now from various World's Fairs for the next 2 or 3 slides. On the right is the Saint Louis exhibit in Paris in 1855, and on the left is the exhibit of Lobmeyer in 1862 in London. There were World's Fairs about every 10 years for the next second half of the century. And you can see chandeliers were also exhibited, a lot of chandeliers. I'm not talking about them so much because, well, they were impressive for their size, but chandeliers had always been made, large-scale chandeliers. It was the increasingly large size of the torchères and the ornamental vases, and then finally other forms of furniture that were so impressive. These are both from the 1862 fair in London. The piece on the left, you see there's a little table there in the Anglo-Venetian style. The glass was made by Joseph Webb, but it was exhibited by the London firm of Dobson and Pierce. And it's probably not very tall. It's not a really large table, but it's one of the first uses in England of glass for a table. The piece on the right, frankly, reminds me of nothing so much as a telephone booth, but it was a display case made by Osler of Birmingham, and it's made at least partially of glass. You can see the gasolier. See if I can make this thing work properly. Yes, that's a gasolier of cut glass. This whole structure is of interlocking cut glass parts. So this was, they were beginning to use more and more glass, more and more cut glass, and more substantial objects made of cut glass. And then these 2 huge things were torchères, which were made for for a couple of the exhibitions. At the Paris Fair of 1855, Osler exhibited a 30-foot gas candelabrum. And then Baccarats were nearly 6 meters high. Baccarat showed a pair of them. And the English writers thought were vastly inferior to Osler's. According to J.B. Waring, Osler had been making such large lighting devices since 1844, when a pair of 18-foot specimens was made for the Pasha of Egypt. This was followed by a 20-foot fixture for the Raja of Nepal in 1849, and a pair of 10-foot ones which stood for the tomb of Muhammad at Medina. So you can see right there that the customers for these things were in the East, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. They exhibited these huge things at the fairs in London and in Paris. No one ever says who bought them or where they went. I find it hard to believe that a 30-foot or a 27-foot torchère really had much practical use. But of course, they were made to impress the audience, and impress the audience they certainly did. Now, the one on the left is Baccarat's exhibit at 1867 in Paris, which has a crystal fountain in the center of it, right there, which somehow never got the publicity that the Osler crystal fountain did. And the piece on the right is by de Vries, and that's a merely 20 feet tall. That's another 1867 one. The monumental, Baccarat's monumental fountain on the left is 7.2 meters high. I think merely because it wasn't the first one, and the one in the Crystal Palace 10 years before, they'd already done that, so Baccarat's didn't receive that much attention. The thing on the right is de Vries' crystal jeweled candelabrum, which is, like I said, nearly 18 foot tall, and that was supposedly sold to Istanbul. So now I'm going to keep going. I think we're finished with the very large torchères. They got that big, and then they don't seem to have made them in quite that size again. I think because they were so impractical. And once all the companies had shown they could do it, they went back to making ones that were a little better styled for your average home. Oh, and this is a massive chandelier, although this is de Vries' chandelier, which was also quite huge. But big chandeliers were kind of taken for granted by that time, so it didn't attract that much attention. The standing piece on the left is by Lobmeyer and was shown in 1867. Lobmeyer also showed a beautiful table of dark blue glass, which was described by several critics, but unfortunately I have not been able to locate a picture of that, so I don't know what the table looked like. And now we're getting into 1876. This is, on the right is an urn which was shown by Lobmeyer at the 1873 World's Fair in Vienna. And on the left is the exhibit of J. Green, who is an English glass cutter of the London area at, of all things, the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. There were quite a few glass displays. That was the only big English display in Philadelphia, and you can see it's chandeliers mostly, and also smaller pieces, and we're out of the let's impress them big standing things. What I wish I had a slide of, but I'll read you a description of, the Mount Washington Glass Company of New Bedford, Massachusetts showed a crystal fountain which won much praise. This was 48 feet in circumference and 17 feet high, and built entirely of prisms of cut crystal glass, which reflected the changing light. It was so arranged that at night it could be lighted up by 120 gas jets concealed within, and then with the dazzling colors reflected from the countless drops, it presented a spectacle of fairy beauty. The fountain was surmounted by the largest crystal figure ever made, a Statue of Liberty 30 inches high. So unfortunately, there is absolutely the only print I've seen of that is actually a stereopticon view. It's so fuzzy, you really can't tell what it is. And that seems to have been totally dismantled. The Mount Washington Company also showed a lovely toilet table made entirely from the crystal substance. The legs are upright scrolls of solid glass. These support a thick slab on whose undersurface geometric forms were cut and then coated with quicksilver, so the top of the table makes hundreds of little mirrors. From either side rise handsomely ornamented standards, and between them swings a plate glass mirror. Unfortunately, that too has disappeared as far as I know. So if any of you know the whereabouts, any of you Mount Washington collectors, of that cut glass dressing table, I would very much like to know it. Now we get into 1878. And the Paris Fair of 1878 had the most tremendous, both Baccarat and the other firms, had tremendous displays of cut glass, which included all kinds of objects. Probably the most impressive, this is Baccarat's display on the left, and you see, get my finger, oh, it's in my hand. You see the Temple of Mercury here, which is a balustrade of cut glass, and behind it a temple with a figure. And that still exists, and I'll have to show you. I'll go forward. Yes, that's where it is today. It was bought by the King of Portugal, and then it's on a private estate in Spain near Barcelona, I understand, today. So this, which you see here, is there in the center. And that created, as you can imagine, a tremendous amount of stir. And it amazes me that it's sat outside for over 100 years and still seems to have survived. Now I'm going to go back one there. This is Osler's cabinet, which was at the 1878 fair. They also exhibited chairs, but this cabinet was 14.5 feet high and 9 inches wide. And although it looks in this drawing to be not, or this print, not particularly impressive, I understand that it was. It's all cut glass. The bottom part of it is wood, but most of the uprights are cut glass. All of these arches are made of cut glass. So it must have been quite impressive, but it seems to have disappeared, although there is at least one later 19th century Osler piece, which is somewhat similar. We're getting into a period now when both Baccarat and Osler were making substantial amounts of this glass. From Baccarat, Osler had already been making it for a while. Baccarat really, after this 1878 fair, got into making larger and larger pieces and cultivating an Eastern market, which they hadn't done before. Okay. Yeah, you can look at that because I think that's very admirable. And we'll move on. And I'm going to, Osler had apparently had, I read you those descriptions earlier of the pieces they had sold to the East. They had been cultivating a market in the East since at least the 1840s. And Baccarat opened an office in India in the 1880s. And they both began to make, to try very diligently to sell. That's where the market was, I think partly because the Indian royalty had a great deal of money, but what with the complete taking over of India by the British, they no longer had much power. So their compensation for that, I guess, was to spend money and to ornament their palaces and make them as grand as possible. I'm going to show you slides of several palaces. On the left is not actually in India, that's Istanbul. And the chandelier was a gift from Queen Victoria to the Sultan of Turkey, so I assume that it's Osler, or at least one of the British firms. And this is a cut glass balustrade which goes all around it. All of the pictures I can find of it say that it's Baccarat, but I don't know. I think it's quite likely to be English if the chandelier is. And that's obviously still in existence because that's a modern photograph. Many of the Indian palaces, and I'm going to show you 2 or 3 slides, had a lot of mirror-facing. These are late 18th century. This one, yes, it's the Dolmabahce Palace on the left in Istanbul. And this is the palace at Udaipur, and I've got a couple of different views of that. This is a late 18th century palace in India, which was also added to in the 19th century. And some of these things they're elaborate and obviously very different from Western taste, but very beautiful. They used a lot of glass mirrored segments and glass, silvery-looking glass, to line parts of the palace. And you can see how the pillars here are faced with little mirrors. You can see how when cut glass furniture became available, it was something that would fit right into that. This is Kota. This is the Palace of Kota. That's more Udaipur, I think. And this on the right is Gwalior, the palace called Jay Vilas. And this is again covered with pieces of cut glass. This is a swing, and this is cut glass up here as well. But that's all Indian made, that's not European. On the left, I told you that Baccarat opened an office in India in the 1880s, and they started trying to sell furniture there. On the left is a slide which was supplied to me by Baccarat, and these are some of the cut glass chairs which they made sometime in the 1880s. I don't think they ever made a lot of furniture, not as much as can be documented otherwise, but they certainly made some. And this is a famous cut glass table, which you may have seen before. When we got this in 1978, the Baccarat people told us that it was exhibited at the World's Fair of 1889. And then when I started doing more research on it, they told me that it was exhibited at the World's Fair of 1878. But as nearly as I can find, Baccarat made several of these tables, but they were not exhibited at any World's Fair. They were made probably in the 1880s. And there seems to be some disagreement about whether 2 of them were made or 4 of them were made, but at any rate 2 of the old ones exist now. One of them is upstairs in our gallery, and that's the one you see on the right. And one was for a while belonged to Liberace, and after he died and his effects were sold, it was bought by someone who loaned it to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And I believe that it is then that gentleman sold it through Mallett's in London, and I believe if you wish to own it, Mallett's has it in London and would probably be happy to talk to you about it. So there's at least one old one. Baccarat has also made recently at least 1 more and possibly 2 more. Again, the articles seem to say there's one in Tokyo, and also there was one at Harrods, which was sold to an Eastern potentate. So I'm not quite clear on whether they've made 1 or 2 of the reproductions. I know I was very startled several years ago when I made a trip to New York, and the Baccarat office on Madison Avenue had one of those in the window. That was the first I knew that they were making them again. These are interesting. They're made by pressing the individual. A lot of the individual pieces are pressed and then cut. So they're polished up by cutting. They're very heavy and very tricky to move around and take apart and put back together. Ours has a marble top. The other one has a glass top. And again, it's not quite clear. Ours perhaps had a glass top to begin with. And that is Baccarat. This is Baccarat's showroom in Paris in 1900. And this is, they made also these small tables. If you look at this, that's something, this tripod foot seems to be something that's, if not unique to Baccarat, at least something they used a lot. Back at the exhibit in 1878, Colnay, who is the American who wrote about the exhibit, mentions 2 large toilet tables of flint glass with tripod feet, the top cut in small diamonds, in the Baccarat exhibit. But I couldn't find any pictures of it, and obviously they were not the big rectangular tables that we have. Toilet tables, I would imagine, would be larger than this, but smaller than the big tables that we have. The Cristallerie outside Pantin also exhibited a large, handsome table of solid crystal. And as far as I know, and interestingly enough, the critic said, this is one of the most regular and handsome pieces in the exposition, far superior to the tables shown by Baccarat. This table was sold to the Shah of Persia. But that also, as far as I know, has disappeared. So it wasn't, although Baccarat and Osler get the credit for making all of the cut glass furniture, in fact, quite a few other firms were making at least some of it. Unfortunately, most of it seems to have disappeared. So I think also Baccarat has reproduced the small table as well. And if you wish to if you wish to own one of those, they will probably make one for you on order. Would look good with a punch bowl on it. I just put that slide in. That's also the Baccarat thing in Paris, because I happen to think she's rather amusing. That's just to show their chandeliers. Now, I have seen several Baccarat large-scale fixtures for sale. I saw those in Kansas City, and I'm afraid I took those slides, which is not why they're not particularly good. In 1983, a dealer in Kansas City called me up and said he had torchères made by Hawks of Corning, cut in the Russian pattern. So I flew out to look at them. And they are indeed cut in the Russian pattern, or certainly a variation of the Russian pattern, but I told him they weren't Hawks, they were Baccarat, and he didn't believe me. I don't know exactly what's happened to them. They were for sale in Kansas City in the 80s. And I have since seen in auction catalogs a couple more. So I know they do come up from time to time. I have no idea how many of them Baccarat made, but it must have been something that was definitely not one of a kind. You could probably order them. And in fact, Baccarat has several of them in their showrooms, both in Paris and at Baccarat, where the factory is. And they're very distinctive with this kind of foot. So they're quite different from the English ones. And they all seem to be cut in pretty much the same pattern. And like all the tall fixtures that I'll show you, they're put together. There's a metal structure inside, and then these glass pieces are individual and fit onto the metal structure. Now then, this is the same table, of course, which I showed you earlier, which is upstairs. As far as we know, the table is about anywhere from 15 to 20 years earlier than the ornament which sits on top of it. We believe that this boat was designed around 1900. It was certainly designed by 1911 when it was purchased. The Baccarat records show that the first example of it was purchased. So we don't know exactly when our table and the boat got together, but they were purchased by a customer sometime around 1911 and left the Baccarat showroom and belonged to a private person until one or more private people until we bought them. As far as I know, the Maharaja of Bikaner in India apparently has another table, or at least another boat. I guess I'm not sure he has the table. When we bought this, we thought the boat was the one that had been purchased by the Maharaja, but apparently that one's still in India. So at least 2 of these boats were made, and as far as I know, one is in India and one is we have, and I don't know where. There aren't any more. Oh, no, sorry, Okay, now we'll move on and leave France and go to England. Without a doubt, the Osler firm of Birmingham was the one which made the most cut glass furniture and which seems to have been most successful. I had done research only on the pieces they exhibited at World's Fairs, but John Smith of Mallets has done very extensive research in the Osler archives and published quite a bit. So most of what I'm having to say is based on John's research. The table on the left, which is blue, Osler seems to be the only one, as nearly as I can tell from reading the descriptions of the other furniture, only one who used much color. All of the Baccarat pieces appear to be colorless, and almost all the other ones I've seen described are apparently colorless. But Osler did make some strongly colored pieces, and the blue table on the left is one from the 1870s which survives. The piece on the right is also from the 1870s. Personally, I think the experiment of putting prisms around the edge is not successful from a design point of view, but I suppose it's all a matter of taste. That's a very handsome table on the left, which is by Osler. And on the right is a room in an Indian palace. I believe that's Gwalior. No, that's the Sheesh Mahal Palace. And you can see that's the same table. I had fun going through the books on Indian palaces and picking out the things that showed glass furniture and trying to, very often the books didn't bother to say if they knew where the furniture was made. Actually, they had a tendency, all the books published in the 1950s and 60s, they had a tendency to think everything was Baccarat. But that is clearly, it's the same as this table. And the chairs, I think, are also Osler. And there's a bed in the background, which I can't see well enough to have any idea what that is. But you can imagine that many, I have a quotation, Jenny Churchill went to Singapore in 1894, and then further on to India. And she said, the Sultan of Johore gave them a sumptuous luncheon and showed them through his palace. In one room, the tables and chairs were made of cut glass, upholstered in bright blue velvet with glass buttons. And apparently there are lots of contemporary descriptions of these Indian palaces or palaces in the Far East generally, full of cut glass furniture with very elaborate upholstery. Although I'm showing you slides of just a few palaces, about 4, they were all over. And after you've looked at enough pictures of them, it's possible to distinguish one manufacturer from another up to a point. The piece on the left is an Osler dresser, which was made, the date of that I think was the 1880s, which I think is very impressive. And the piece on the right is obviously a chair, which is also Osler, from, I think, about 1890. Interestingly enough, the dates and I'm going to show you several chairs, and except for the upholstery, they're all pretty much alike. And their dates vary anywhere from the late 80s right up to about 1910. And the dates are looking at the Osler factory records, you can tell when they were ordered. So they made the same chair over a period of 20 years. But each order is recorded, so you can tell how many were made. I think it's interesting that the style lasted that long. There's no particular way to tell an 1880s chair from a 1910 chair. Okay. There. See, that's the same. That's just a slightly different upholstery. They've been coming up. I've got several slides I've taken from auction catalogs. That one on the left was taken from a Sotheby's catalog. They've started coming up at auction in the last few years. So if you want one for your living room, I think American cut glass collectors, many of whom have punch bowls and things like that, really, I think you ought to go into chairs now and tables. I think a really nice cut glass center table with a really nice American punch bowl on it would make a good addition to your collection. And these things are just stunning, although I have a feeling that I'd ladder my stockings if I sat down on one of the chairs. It's hard for me to imagine living with them, but they're certainly stunning. And these are original designs from the Osler factory on the left, so you can see how they were designed and how they were made. I think the upholstery in all the ones I've shown you is new. Doesn't look like 100-year-old upholstery to me. And that's just a close-up of one of the pieces because I wanted to show you. You have to see the detail. If you go up and look at our torchère, which I'll show you a slide of shortly, look at the detail in the cutting. It's really, really good. And how the design of these things, when you had to have a certain number of odd-sized pieces which were going to fit together, and to get the cuts to come out just right, so that when you put like assembling a crossword or a jigsaw puzzle, and to have it all come out perfectly, it had to be very carefully designed. And then this is another piece in an Indian palace, which I think is also an Osler piece. I didn't have any other pictures of that particular one. Let's see if I do this right. Yes, this is a clock. This is also a slide from one of Mallet's publications. I think there are a couple of these clocks. One was made for the the King of Nepal in 1909. This is another one. This is not the King of Nepal's clock, but it's identical. And the detail is from that clock, just to show you. Frankly, I'd love to hear it strike. I can't imagine how the echoes in a cut glass body would sound. And this is an interesting series of slides. On the left is a room in the palace at Gwalior. This is the Shees Mahal Palace, I think it is. And I'm going to show you a couple of different views of it, because one of the interesting things I found is that there are some Osler pieces here. There are three layer tables for which the design is in the Osler pattern book, and in fact there is one of them at the museum in Birmingham in England where the Osler pattern books are. However, there are some other pieces in that room which seem to have been made by this factory, which until recently has not been well known. This is the factory of Colburn Hill in Stourbridge, England, which was run originally by Joseph Webb, and at this time was run by the heirs of Joseph Webb, or the executors of Joseph Webb. They got a lot of publicity. This particular brochure is dated 1884 and is in the Rakow Library. And several of these pieces have turned up in some of the slides. You can see this chair here, which is different from the Osler chairs, is this chair. So in this room, there's a mixture of Osler and of Colburn Hill furniture. And I'll show you a couple more slides. We've had this for quite a long time. I haven't had an occasion to publish it before, although I had been meaning to. Let's see if I can get this right. See, this is the same room from a different angle. Here's the Osler table, and then the chairs, which are Colburn Hill. It's hard for me to see from this angle, but this piece here, I believe, is this one. I have 3 slides of this room, and when I'm a little closer to them, I can see the objects of furniture a little better. But this piece and the chairs are all in that room. Let's see if I can try again, and you can get a better look at it. Oh, this is a black and white photograph of the Colburn Hill furniture, which John Smith turned up and published a couple of years ago, I think. And you can see they're quite distinctive because the back of the chairs is different from any of the other manufacturers. That's this one. There has been at least one contemporary report in the 1880s, I think in 84. There were 2 different reports in the Pottery Gazette. On a visit to Stourbridge during the past month, we had the pleasure of seeing, in an advanced state of completion, a magnificent glass chiffonier made by the executors of the late Joseph Webb of Colburn Hill. But to adequately describe the beautiful suite of cut crystal glass furniture upholstered in crimson satin that we also saw would be extremely difficult. The design is of a medieval kind, and what under ordinary circumstances would be a display of artistically carved woodwork is here represented in chased cut crystal. The harmony in the colors employed for decoration leaves nothing to be desired, and the whole reflects the highest credit on the firm producing it, while at the same time it is another proof of the rapid strides that are being made in the development of the glassmaking industry. We understand that this suite is intended for an Oriental potentate. Well, I think it looks like it deserves an Oriental potentate, doesn't it? Okay, I think I must be supposed to press this one now. Let's go back here. Yes, and see here are these chairs. And this is all the same room in the Indian Palace at Gwalior. I'm just showing you different angles. So now we get to this. I'm sorry, I don't seem to have them quite in the right order, but if you look over here, you'll see this, which is the other thing that was on that Colburn Hill. So it's kind of exciting to have come up, as I said, I've known we had that ad for quite a long time. And I hadn't looked before, but it's very interesting to have found the furniture which is shown in the ad in these pictures of the Indian palaces. Now I'm going to talk about lighting, which is why I keep coming back to this chandelier. These are pictures of Osler lighting. Osler, like many British firms, made a specialty of large lighting devices for public rooms and for large-scale homes. Of course, there were a lot more large-scale homes in England than there were in the United States, as well as in places like India. So there wasn't nearly as much market for that sort of thing over here. But the English firms could make a lot of large-scale lighting devices. If you can imagine what you think of as the stately homes of England, they all had chandeliers. In the 1870s, the piece on the left is from 1872, and is a fixture for candles. And they started out being for candles, and then a lot of them were developed for gas. The slide on the right is actually a later catalog page, but I just wanted to show you how you could, these are the pieces of which a chandelier is made. And you could probably customize your chandelier to a certain extent by choosing different kinds of cutting and different shapes of pieces for it. Oh, this is a red chandelier in a palace in India. And also, this is a glass balustrade there. The red chandelier, I'm pretty sure is Osler. The glass balustrade, I don't know. None of the captions I could find for this picture, and I found it in several different publications, had any idea where the balustrade was made. But at any rate, the red chandelier, I would say, is probably Osler. The one on the left is ours. It was purchased, we purchased it from a dealer who bought it in India, and it was one of a pair. I think it's very handsome in the case upstairs. As I said, only Osler, as nearly as I can tell, made these colored pieces. And then that's our torchère, which is upstairs. That's from the 1890s. And it's also Osler. And that's a big chandelier. That's Osler chandelier in the palace at Gwalior. And then the next slide, that's one more, yes. This is an electric fixture. You see, when the fixtures became electric, one of the things to notice is that the arms suddenly turned down instead of up. As long as they were for candles, the holders went up, and then when you could easily convert candles to gas, and also the shades pointed up. But all of a sudden, when you get to electricity, it doesn't work that well, and so you have to reverse the arms and point everything down. And if you're trying to restore a chandelier and it's been electrified, that's something you should look at carefully and see exactly if the arms are going the way they're supposed to. And this is just for fun. In that same dining room, and this then is an electric fixture. We have, by this time you're after 1900, and this is an electric fixture also from Osler, which I think is very handsome. So you see it, and it's hanging down, as you can see. One of the things that I find interesting about the introduction of electricity is that a lot of people thought it was so bright it would ruin your eyes. And that's why you have these closed globes, so that you don't have to look into the glare of an electric light bulb. The earlier ones, like the one that was on the left, had the open shades, but then they had the closed shades later. Yes. And this is also in the palace at Gwalior, and it isn't a piece of furniture. It's a train that ran around the table to deliver to the gentlemen their port and cigars at the close of the dinner. I just happen to think that's fun, so I had a slide made of it. That's kind of the ultimate luxury as far as I'm concerned. And that's an English piece that was made by Armstrong, Whitworth and Company in London. I think a little boy ordered that. Now I'm going to show you some fountains. That's a drawing from the Osler pattern book on the left, or, well, no, but it's an Osler drawing. And on the right, you see the fountain. And there's also in the background some pieces of glass furniture, which are probably also Osler. So if you want a fountain for your drawing room or for your courtyard, obviously you could get them in several different sizes. You didn't have to have big ones like that. This is that's another one, also in an Indian palace. And here, if you wanted a small fountain for your table, that's a drawing from the Osler pattern books on the left, and it's a piece which we are going to acquire on the right. They aren't exactly the same. There's something missing up here. I don't know whether this piece has lost its top or what exactly, or whether it's just a different, slightly different design. But at any rate, I think this makes an absolutely beautiful centerpiece. The water sprayed out here. You put water up there, and it came down the brass tubes and sprayed out here and watered your flowers. So I think if you want to have, if you want to have a really nice centerpiece for your dinner table, I think that would have been one. So by the time we have seminar next year, I trust I'll have that on view. Although, unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to put silk flowers on it. I think real flowers wouldn't do too well in our cases. Okay. There were other kinds of glass furniture. Let's see how much time I have. Okay, I think I'm okay. In the late 19th century, the Italians also had made some experiments with glass furniture, but theirs were mirrored pieces rather than being the cut glass pieces that the French and the English were making. So here is an Italian mirror from the 1880s, and here's a mirror-covered settee, also from the 1880s. Again, they really don't look very comfortable to me, and I don't think they were made in anything like the quantity that the French and the British pieces were. There were glass screens. The piece you see on the left is our arts and crafts screen. There never seemed to have been a lot of these made. I showed you the Russian one earlier, and I'm going to show you a couple more. Or else they're fragile and they haven't survived. But I have not been able to locate very many screens. So I think the one on the left is extremely beautiful. It dates from the 1880s. The piece on the right is a tabletop, which we've had for quite a while, and you've probably seen before. We don't really know what the legs and what the base of it would have looked like, but it's inlaid with, it's a mosaic made of pieces of mostly ancient glass, which have been flattened and melted and worked into a design, as well as some glass, some newer glass, and the table was probably made in the 1860s. A couple of weeks ago, I was in London, and I went to see the Gilbert collection at Somerset House. It's a wonderful collection of, among other things, micro-mosaic pieces, boxes, all kinds, and tables. And I went around trying to find one of they have wonderful micro-mosaic tables, some which have newer fittings, but at least half a dozen of them. The whole piece was original, legs and everything. And so I was trying to find at least a postcard or something I could make a slide of for this talk, so I could show you what one of the Italian late 19th century micro-mosaic tables looked like. But unfortunately, they were not well equipped with photographs of their collection, so I can't help you there. But there are a lot, well, I won't say a lot, but at any rate, there are quite a few of these mosaic tables made. And there's another fire screen. This one is in the collection of Lillian Nassau in New York, and that's Tiffany, and was exhibited, I think, at the World's Fair of 1900. I don't know why there are a few more Tiffany screens. I've seen several in other museums. But they're not nearly as many screens as windows, for instance, although I would have thought that it would be easier to have a screen because you could move it around and use it where you wanted to. And this is a piece which is which was made by Dome, and it's about the same date as the ticking screen. It's 1898. I don't think that's particularly practical as a table, but it's certainly an object of beauty, and it's the only table I found in the Art Nouveau style. Now, Saint Louis continued to make elaborate fixtures, as did Osler, if they were ordered. That's a Saint Louis fountain in one of the Indian palaces, which was actually not ordered until the late 20s. So the Maharajas continued to order these things, and the factories that stayed in business continued to make them. Now I'm going to talk about American pieces for a while. The American factories simply didn't go in for this large-scale production. There was not, I think, any kind of a demand for it in this country. The very wealthiest people who had the largest homes were, if they were thinking of large-scale fountains, were probably going to order them from abroad. But at any rate, some of the American lighting devices are fairly large-scale. The piece on the left is a kerosene lamp attributed to Hawks. The piece on the right is also a kerosene lamp, although it's lost its top globe. And that's in a private collection. And here you see on the left one of the only two standing fixtures that I've ever found. This is the lamp which was exhibited at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. It was made by the Strauss Company and was bought by Milton Hershey, and you can see it at the Hershey Museum. I did have a slide of it in Hershey's house, but I was unable to locate that. But that's what it looked like in Chicago. Interestingly enough, and we had it here on loan in 1977. When we first discovered it, that is, Estelle Sinclair and I, and looked at it, she was convinced that no American firm could have made a piece that big, and she thought it had been probably ordered from Osler in England and then just, stamped by Strauss. But that did not turn out to be the case, as I'm sure Craig will mention tomorrow. But I think it's interesting that there were so few pieces in that scale made in this country that it just didn't occur to us that it could really be American. And that's an electrolier. And then the piece on the right is also an electric fixture. That's in our collection. And there are about half a dozen of these known at various museums. I've not been able to figure out exactly which glass factory made them. They've been variously attributed to the Quaker City factory and to Fry, I think. And although there are pieces similar in the catalogs of those companies, there's nothing identical. So it does not really have a firm attribution. And that's a table which was made by the Libby firm for the 1904 World's Fair. The 1905 World's Fair, the Fry Company made a table, well, a standing punch bowl, I guess, more than a table. But it was a punch bowl with a kind of tabletop under it with cups on it. And we had that here on loan in 1977, and I thought we had a slide of it, but I couldn't find it. That's in a private collection out in Colorado now. But as far as I can tell, those are almost the only pieces, and this, of course, which if anyone ever finds, I hope you'll tell me about. That, as far as I know, has disappeared. That's the only known picture of it. I don't know what it's for, except to show off. But the Quaker City Glass Company exhibited that at the St. Louis World's Fair. So there was a vogue specifically within American glass companies at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century to see who could make the biggest piece. And we were always seeing newspaper stories of the biggest punch bowl, and I'm sure this vase was an attempt to win to get some publicity for the biggest vase ever made. But basically, these large-scale pieces were not made in this country anywhere to the extent that they were made abroad. And then this is only the second standing piece that I know of. This belongs to Martin Fold out in Los Angeles, and originally the person who first showed it to me in 1979 was when I first heard about it. The person she bought it from said that it had been exhibited at the St. Louis World's Fair, but it was not, because it's not Quaker City and it's not Libby, which were the only American firms exhibiting. And I read the descriptions of their exhibits very carefully, and there was no standing lamp at the World's Fair. But as nearly as we can tell, it might have been made by the Liberty Glass Works in Egg Harbor City, New Jersey, because there is some record that they had a lamp like this, which was exhibited at jewelry stores as an advertising piece for their firm. And that's So it may have been exhibited at a St. Louis jewelry store. It may certainly have been in St. Louis, but it wasn't exhibited at the World's Fair. It's a very nice quality piece. And I'm really a little surprised that not more of them were made. You know, there's the Hershey one, 1893, and there's this one, 1905 or so. And there doesn't seem to have been anything in between, and no other American production of these large electric fixtures that I know of. But perhaps they just weren't practical for American homes. Now, I am going to talk briefly about glass furniture. That wasn't the end of glass furniture. It's kind of the end of cut glass furniture. But there was quite a lot of interest in glass furniture, except the whole styles changed when you get after 1905. I'm going to talk about things. Oh, I'd forgotten about that. This is the cut glass bed, which Hawks made for Oliver Brothers, which was shown at the exhibit, the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1900. And that has disappeared. We have no idea what happened to that. But Hawks made it because I found the entries in the pattern book. But what they did was make the cut glass pieces, which they sold to Oliver Brothers, and Oliver Brothers put it together with the brass and made the bed. So Hawks didn't literally make the bed. And it would, I suppose if nobody bought it, they just disassembled it. So it may not necessarily have existed for long after the fair. Oh, and I wanted to show you that. This is the Dream Garden, the mosaic which was designed in Philadelphia, and which Kirk Nelson wrote about in our last issue of the Bulletin. It was created in 1915. It's a Tiffany mosaic after a design by Maxwell Parrish. And I wanted to show it because it's an architectural use of glass, which is not quite furniture. And it's been in the news a lot lately because there was a proposal to take it out of the Curtis Building in Philadelphia and send it to Las Vegas. As far as we know, that's been stopped. But if I were you and you're in Philadelphia, I'd go and look at it because it is a stupendous piece. And we can't be absolutely certain that it will stay there very often. As I said, I decided to put it in even though it isn't furniture because some of these next slides that I'm having are architectural uses of glass. And you'll see from, this is 1915, this is sort of the end of Art Nouveau. We're in 5 years, 1920 with the piece on the left and this one, you have a wholly different aesthetic in glass. And it's just a complete turnaround. And I'm going to show you some tables and lighting devices by Lalique and by other French firms from the 1920s and the 1930s. They're also stunning uses of glass, but they're quite different from the ones that you've just seen. And it amazes me the turnaround in styles which happen so quickly. These are both Lalique lighting fixtures from the 1920s. And these are tables. The table on the left, I think, is 1927, and the one on the right is 1931. And that's a screen, which was designed by Lunaire, and that's a fountain that was designed by Lalique in 1933. So you see, fountains stay popular. Glass fountains always look nice, because if you light them properly, the falling water and the glass just play off of each other. And I think that's another glass table, also from the 1930s. Almost all of these are from the 1930s. And here are two more tables from the 1930s, which are similar but not exactly the same. But you can see there was a great interest in using, that's what I was trying to come to. This is the Lalique. This is from 1926 and was made for Wanamaker's department store. I think that's really stunning, and I hope you'll all look at it upstairs. Those of you who've been here before remember that it was installed in the Raycow Library. And when we first installed it there in 1980, it had some space around it and you could see it. But gradually, as the library got crowded with books and users and microfilm readers, it got to the point where you could hardly see the Lalique panel. And so it has been on view, but sort of hidden. So if you go and look at it in the Modern Glass Gallery upstairs, I think it just looks really wonderful. And that was created for Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia for the men's clothing department. I think it's, again, a stunning architectural use of glass. Now, the table on the left, I think, is Sabino from 1931. And there's another Lalique screen, which I think is quite fascinating. That's in Tokyo now, and that's in the 1930s. Oh, and here, this is one of my Yes, we're back to Indian palaces. When the people in the Indian palaces got tired of the cut glass furniture, they liked Art Deco things. And so this is the same room in one of the Indian palaces. You see, this is a 1925 or 1930 blue glass dressing table. And you can see part of it over here as well. But then there's one of those octagonal cut glass tables from Osler, which I showed you in one of the first slides, in the same room with it. So this palace is, see if I wrote down which one. Yes, that's the Morvik Palace. And it has both cut glass from the 1880s and French glass from the 1930s. Obviously, they really like glass furniture. I think it's kind of amusing to see them in the same room. And that's a table designed by Bugatti on the left from the 1930s, and one designed by Donald Besky from 1931 on the right. So, well, you can see that. I think it's kind of fascinating. Oh, and yes, that's my last slide. I guess you're not going to see the Donald Besky all that well. But you could see that it was very plain. It had a plain glass top and then metal underpinning. And when you come into that, that begins to be the aesthetic that goes forward into the 1950s with the use of plate glass and not so much decoration beside it. I'm ending with that. And this, on the left is Frederick Carter's cast glass architectural panels for Rockefeller Center in New York, which were put in place in the late 30s. And on the right is the table that was shown at the Glass Center in 1939 in the Glass Center that was part of the 1939 World's Fair. And that's upstairs in our galleries. So you've come from those very elaborate pieces in the late 18th century through the 19th century pieces, which were, if anything, more elaborate, until you have a turnaround in the 20s and 30s, and you end up with a great use of glass in furniture, but it's now perfectly plain. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. I can't see you out there. Does anyone have any questions? Yes? I've seen pressed glass coffins. I've seen a couple of ads for them. I haven't actually, someone actually owns a miniature that is a salesman's sample. I have never seen a description of a cut glass coffin, no. I suppose it's possible, but I haven't seen a description of one that I know of. Anyone else? Yes? Well, that's true. We actually have one, but I decided that I was giving a lecture long enough. So I didn't put that. And that's a bit later. That's Mark Lely. That's not Renee Lely. I wanted to cut it off with the 1930s echo sort. There's lots of other glass furniture as you get later into the 20th century. But I had to cut it off somewhere, or you'd have been here all night. Okay. Well, if you don't have any more questions, you may clap if you wish. If you don't have any questions, you can't get up and leave unless you're not staying for the next lecture, because I'm about to introduce our next lecturer. As David said,